China is known for their lightning speed when it comes to infrastructure development, so despite the Zhuanyang Viaduct in Wuhan only being 16 years old, it was already overdue for a replacement. Spanning a whopping 3.5 kilometers, the Zhuanyang Viaduct is the longest concrete bridge ever to be demolished in China. The sheer length of the viaduct wasn't the only thing that proved to be challenging. Another factor that's making it all the more difficult is that the Zhuanyang Viaduct goes through a fairly populated residential district in the city. To make matters worse, major gas pipes and power transmission lines all ran parallel below the viaduct. To make sure that everything would go as cleanly as possible, the engineers covered the piers of the viaduct and then padded them with water-filled tanks. This was done to absorb the shock waves that the explosion would produce and to reduce the spread of dust. On the night of the demolition, everything went according to plan, as the 3.5-kilometer-long viaduct came crashing to the ground in spectacular fashion. Kosciuszko Bridge was a truss bridge that passed through the Newtown Creek in New York City. At the time of its construction, it was only meant to carry around 10,000 vehicles, which was quite reasonable given the amount of vehicles in New York in the late 1930s. But when the bridge became part of the interstate highway system, it now saw a daily average of around 180,000 vehicles. So in 2017, after almost 8 decades of congestion and overloading, the state of New York decided to finally get rid of the bridge, which was already showing its age. With a few hundred spectators on site during the demolition, over 900 charges were detonated, bringing 10 million kilos of steel to the ground. Number 7. The Henry Lawrence Bridge. For the next demolition, we travel to the state of Kentucky. The Henry Lawrence Memorial was constructed in 1932 and served as the only roadway across the Cumberland River in the entire state. In 2012, a cargo vessel accidentally struck the nearby Egner's Ferry Bridge, which was also constructed during the 1930s. The impact caused the main pier to collapse, almost taking 4 vehicles with it. After the incident, state officials raised concern regarding the safety of the Henry Lawrence as well. 3 years later, the state of Kentucky deemed the bridge obsolete, and it was scheduled to be demolished and replaced with a $128 million arch bridge. On the morning of April 11, 2018, a series of explosions brought it down in spectacular fashion. Black smoke rose from the site as piles of debris fell into the Cumberland River. Shortly after that, 2 cranes were used to pick up the steel and rubble that fell into the river to be used as scrap metal. Whoa. Constructed in 1967, the Ponte Morandi was an integral bridge that linked the mountainous seaside city of Genoa to the rest of Italy and neighboring France. It stood 45 meters above the city and spanned 1.1 kilometers. In 2018, a 210-meter section of the bridge collapsed in the midst of heavy rains. Coupled with poor maintenance practices, the cables corroded and finally snapped, bringing the deck and dozens of vehicles passing through down along with it. 43 people unfortunately lost their lives in this incident. Rescuers found it very difficult to reach survivors who were trapped under thousands of tons of concrete as the bridge collapsed over a residential area. The Morandi collapse in 2018 was the 12th bridge collapse in the country since 2004, and citizens were starting to get worried about the safety of their public roads and highways. Ever since the incident, the remaining segments of the Ponte Morandi remained standing and have become a stark reminder of the tragic event. In 2019, what remained of the Ponte Morandi was now set to be demolished through a controlled implosion. Apartment buildings were evacuated, and the hydrants on the ground were opened to reduce the amount of dust in the air after the explosion. After a loud bang, the symbol of Genoa's dark past was now reduced to nothing but rubble. The regional president of Liguria even called the demolition a symbolic one because it meant that this skyline that reminded us every day of the tragedy of August 14th will no longer be there, and that Genoa will now enter its future. Going back to the state of New York, the Tappan Zee Bridge was the longest bridge to ever be demolished in New York. It was almost 5 kilometers long and crossed the Hudson at one of its widest points. Constructed back in 1950, it was designed to last only 50 years because of material shortages and cost cutting. And by 2010, it had already crossed this supposed deadline, and plans to tear it down were already being drafted. The demolition was cut into 2 parts. First, the western structure was carefully lowered onto waiting barges and eventually sunk in the Atlantic coast of New York to serve as artificial reefs. Finally, the eastern part was blown up on the 15th of January 2019, as thousands of onlookers gathered by the Hudson to witness the historic bridge's final moments.